So I started working in the sector probably in my early 20s. I did a social work, my undergrad was a social work degree. So really from, I don't know, late 1980s, I've been involved in the third sector. I was obviously a very young thing then. And so I did lots of kind of frontline work and community development work. And then I ended up doing more kind of, volunteer orientation and coordination. And I just gradually ended up taking on roles of more responsibility. So I've worked in many different types of organizations, range of roles from like frontline community worker to chief executive, different types of organizations, different sizes. I've worked in unionized, non-unionized environments. I've worked in a collective. So a real sort of range of experiences. I guess latterly, maybe the last 10, 15 years of last 10 years of my career, I had chief executive roles, so very different kind of role in terms of, much more engagement with staff and stakeholders as opposed to clients or service users. So yes, I guess increasingly I was interested in the relationship between the third sector and the state. And that was what very much shaped my PhD research. And so I went from working in the sector to researching the sector's relationship with the state. And that leads me to where I am now, which is that I've been continuing to do research that in some way connects with the third sector. I'd be interested in, I feel like I've never left the sector, and I'm still very involved in, I'm involved in the sector in different ways, but I'm not interested in the kind of job I used to have. I got very tired and a little burnt out, to be honest. The chief exec kind of role is very, it's a very intense role, a lot of responsibility. So I wouldn't want to be involved in delivering programs and services and dealing with a board, but I'd certainly be interested in working in the sector in a sort of research policy kind of role. My very early years after high school were in the private sector and in the accounting field. I worked there for several years. It was a very different, part of what was different for me about working in the private sector was the philosophy, because ultimately it was about results and, time getting billed out in 15-minute increments and things like that. So it just was the wrong ethos for me in particular. Now, I know that's a bit of a broad statement, and there are private sector organizations, especially like social enterprises, for example, where you'd actually have a social mission as well as a kind of an economic kind of mission. So yeah, I guess I think it's the ethos that is quite different. And part of that ethos is about the engagement with community and with service users, with clients, whatever language you want to use. And again, that's a little bit of a kind of a normative, idealistic statement, but in general, I think that is what distinguishes the third sector from either the public sector or the private sector. Now, there's a huge range of types of organizations within the sector. So if you go to like a really large third sector organization that does lots of contracts with government, probably they look and feel a lot like some private sector organizations. And there has been a pattern in the last 15 years or so of hiring chief executives from the private sector, or hiring chief executives that have like an MBA becomes kind of a requirement, whereas in the past, it was much more important that you kind of came up through, sort of community involvement. So not to make blanket statements, but certainly my experience of the sector has been it's much more kind of values driven and connected to a real mission. There's a real mission that guides what the organization does.